I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's Libertarian Angle. The show, as longtime supporters of FFF know, brings you the principled and compromising case for the free society. I want to talk to you today about the Pentagon's and the CIA's torture and prison center at Guantanamo Bay. As you all know, this thing's been operating since around the 9/11 attacks. It's essentially become a permanent edifice. The Supreme Court has never shut it down. And I want to put it in the context of the power that the national security state holds within our federal governmental system. Those of you that are familiar with my work know that I've been recommending for a few years now a fantastic book called National Security and Double Government by Michael Glennon. Glennon's thesis is very simple, that with the advent of the national security state type of governmental system, the national security branch of the government, he doesn't call it a branch, but I do. It really is a separate branch of the government as compared to the executive, legislative, and judicial, that branch wields the real total power in the federal government. And they let the other three branches have a veneer of power that makes them look like they're in charge. But in fact, the people that are running this government, especially with respect to foreign policy, but to a large extent domestic policy too, because of their dominance of economic affairs, where they spend so much money in terms of the tax-funded largesse that's bestowed on them, that they really are in charge here. And Glennon's not just some crackpot author. This is a man with credentials. He is a professor of law at Tufts University. He has served as counsel for some Senate committee. I think it was Foreign Relations, but I'm not sure. You can Google Michael J. Glennon, and you can see the man's credentials. And he makes sense. It's a very easily readable book. It's a scholarly book, but he makes sense that with the advent of this type of governmental system, that made the Pentagon, the CIA, and the NSA, which are the three principal components of the national security branch of the government, essentially omnipotent, all-powerful within the governmental system. Now, and what's going on in Guantanamo really does reflect this. As you all may know, there's people there, for example, that have been there more than 10 years without a trial. Now, if you look at the Constitution, it guarantees the right of speedy trial. Well, I'll guarantee you that 10 years without a trial violates the speedy trial requirement. But what has the Supreme Court done about it? Nothing. I mean, what could they do? They have to defer to the overwhelming power of the national security establishment. And it works like this in any national security state. If you go to Pakistan or Egypt or Myanmar, the national security branch of the government, which oftentimes just takes full overt control, is the one in charge. Everybody else defers to them. One of the classic examples of a national security state was in Chile. They were a national security state type of governmental system back in the 70s and prior to that time. Massive military intelligence establishment, very powerful. And they got dissatisfied with their democratically elected president, Salvador Allende, so they just took control. And the judiciary deferred to them. The Congress, I'm not even sure he permitted the Congress to remain, but if he did, they deferred to him. I mean, this is just a practical matter that when they have the guns, they have the armaments, the tanks, the jet planes, the other three branches know that they can't stand up against that, and therefore they have to automatically defer. Now, in some national security states, like in Myanmar, all of the military and intelligence functions are just combined under the military. But that's just a distinction without a difference. Here it's divided into three parts. The massive military industrial complex, as President Eisenhower called it. Then you've got the CIA, and then you got the NSA. And to a certain extent, you have the FBI, too, that it became a de facto member of the national security establishment a long time ago. So at this point, let me digress a minute and go back in American history and examine the three types of governmental systems that we've had in American history, because I think there's a common perception that we've always had the same type of governmental system. We're taught that in our civics classes in high school and so forth, but such is clearly not the case. We started out under a governmental system called the Articles of Confederation, and this was an unusual type of governmental system. The federal government, there was a federal government, but it was more in the terms of that states as independent sovereigns had gotten together to serve, to have, to come together with mutual goals, common goals, and so forth. And so they did form a federal government, but it was more like a confederation. That was his name, Confederation of sort of independent sovereign states. And the federal government's powers were so weak that it didn't even have the power to tax people. Imagine that, a federal government, a national government that doesn't have the power to tax. And the American people wanted it that way. You see, they didn't want an omnipotent government, a government with big powers. They didn't want a government with the power to do good things for you or bad things to you. And they wanted a really weak government. Why? Well, because they perceived government in general to be the biggest threat to their freedom and well-being. I mean, these were unusual people, these Americans. They believed that their own government, not some foreign government, their own government was a huge threat to their own freedom and their well-being. And that's why when they came together in the Articles, they said, this federal government's not going to have any powers at all, or very few powers, including it's not going to even have the power to tax us. Well, there were problems that they operated under this governmental system for 10 years or more. But problems arose. There were trade wars between the states, between these sovereign entities, and other difficulties. So the delegates meet in Philadelphia to come up with modifications to the Articles, and they're meeting in secret, and that's their goal, and everybody assumes that's what's going to be happening. Well, lo and behold, they come out with a proposal for a different type of governmental system, and this one came to be known by the name of a limited government republic. And this was where the Constitution was proposing a new governmental system with expanded powers, including the power to tax. Well, as you can imagine, the American people were very leery of this. They said, okay, now we're looking at some real danger here. Because, again, the people living at that time in the United States perceived that government was their greatest threat, their own government, to their freedom and their well-being. And so they said, we bring this type of government in, it's going to do bad things to people, including us. It's going to do what the English government had done to English subjects, that they had tortured them, the Tower of London, and they had held them without due process of law, without a trial, indefinite detention. They did some pretty nasty things to their own people. And the American people were just very leery of this. And they were especially leery of a giant military establishment. That you can see the quotes from the founding fathers of, like, a standing army is your greatest threat to freedom, because how do you oppose a standing army? And that this is what tyrants throughout history have used to impose tyranny, is a giant military establishment. The reason's obvious, that the giant military establishment's got armaments, guns, troops. So when it needs to establish order in society, in other words, to impose a tyrannical society, it's got the means to do that. And so Americans were very leery about what they called standing armies, permanent armies. They didn't like them. They liked the idea of a citizen soldier that was, citizens that are well trained to fight if the situation calls for it, but in their everyday lives are out there just as civilians. And then when the emergency comes, the citizen soldiers rally and join up to wage the war. But as soon as the war's over, they go back to their daily lives. That was the idea. So they were very leery, but the proponents of the Constitution said, no, look, this government's different. It's not going to wield omnipotent powers. It's not going to have the power to do whatever it needs to do for the interests of the people or interests of society. This is a government whose powers are going to be limited to those that are enumerated in the document itself. That's why it's called a limited government republic. And so if a power isn't enumerated in this document, it cannot be exercised. And the idea was that the federal judicial branch of the government, the Supreme Court, the federal courts, would enforce this, that whenever the government went beyond those enumerated powers, which was anticipated that they would do. I mean, it was no surprise that they would do that because that's the propensity of government. If they didn't have that propensity, there would be no need to have limited government powers enumerated here. So, and then on the power to tax, they said, yeah, we understand that the power to tax is the power to destroy and to protect Americans. We're going to let them only impose indirect taxes. So like a sales tax or something, which is not as tyrannical or intrusive as a direct tax like an income tax. And so the American people finally decided to go along with this under this enumerated powers doctrine. But to make sure that these people, federal officials, got the point, they demanded the enactment of the Bill of Rights, which really should have been called a Bill of Prohibitions, because it really is a list of restrictions on the government. Americans understood that their rights don't come from the government. They don't come from the Constitution. They don't come from the Bill of Rights. They come from nature and nature's God, like Jefferson had said in the Declaration of Independence. Their rights pre-exist government. That we're free, not because government's letting us be free. Our freedom pre-exists. It's part of our nature. It's our right. So they said, we're going to demand the enactment of these restrictions, a Bill of Prohibitions. So if you look at the First Amendment, for example, a lot of school kids are taught that the First Amendment gives people the right of free speech and the right of freedom of religion and so forth. It doesn't do any such thing. It was crafted very carefully that the Congress shall enact no law restricting freedom of speech or freedom of the press and so forth. So these rights pre-exist. Now, then there's, of course, the right to keep and bear arms, the Second Amendment. But keep in mind that people's right to keep and bear arms, contrary to what gun controllers say, doesn't come from the Constitution, doesn't come from the Bill of Rights. It's a restriction. But even if you had not enacted the Second Amendment, there is no power enumerated in the Constitution to take away people's guns, and therefore they couldn't be exercised, even if you didn't have the Bill of Rights. Now, there's a set of amendments that are designed to restrict the power of government when it wants to come and do bad things to you, that when it wants to jail you or kill you, or hold you temporarily, that they saw the danger of this. And they had seen, of course, the English government where it just would go and pick somebody up, bring them in, torture them. And so many of the due process and the procedural protections that are in the Fourth Amendment, the Fifth Amendment, the Sixth Amendment, the Eighth Amendment actually came from the resistance of British subjects to British tyranny. They were just carved out over centuries of resistance to the tyranny of their own government. And one of these was due process of law. That's a term that's in the Fifth Amendment. It's also later in the 14th Amendment, which is a restriction on the powers of the states. But the Fifth Amendment was a restriction on the power of the federal government, and it said that before you can take any person's life away from him, you have to accord him due process of law. And due process of law is a term that goes all the way back to Magna Carta in the year 1215. And it came to be meaning notice and trial. Notice and hearing. In other words, if before you can do bad things to a person, saying to the government, before you could jail him or kill him, you have to give him formal notice of what he's being charged with, what's the crime he's being charged with, and then you have to accord him a trial. And then in these Bill of Rights, it was also guaranteed the right of trial by jury if people elected to do so. The trial by jury is just, regular citizens deciding the guilt or innocence of an accused. So if the government wants to kill somebody, they first have to charge him with some crime, And then in the trial, it's not the judge that determines guilt. It's not a tribunal. Americans didn't trust judges and tribunals. They wanted regular, ordinary citizens to decide whether a person's guilty or not, and therefore whether the government could kill him. Now, there was always a chance that the government would keep people in jail indefinitely and say, yeah, we're going to give you a trial next week. And, after 20 years or so, they're still saying, oh, yeah, your trial's coming next week. So that was the idea of guaranteeing the right of speedy trial. They didn't want the trial to be hanging over somebody's head for the rest of his life there. And so you've got these protections right to the effective assistance of counsel that, our ancestors understood that the power of government is so overwhelming that you want to give the accused as much advantage as possible. And one of these is to hire a lawyer to defend yourself, because the government's resources are enormous, and it's got lawyers and professionals, and they have access to all kinds of investigative resources. So these procedural protections are trying to even the score a little bit. So the accused has the right to come into court with a lawyer as compared to being forced to get in there and start defending himself, especially within the complexities of a trial. So this is what was a limited government republic, and it was our form of government for 150 years or so, with a very, very minimal military force. Now, there was a, if you will, standing army, a permanent army, but very small. And that's the way they wanted it, enough to quell revolts by Native Americans, protect people from attacks from Native Americans, but certainly not anything like we live under today, or other national security state nations live under. It's a very small, basic military force. Of course, no intelligence concept, no CIA, no NSA, no FBI. There was essentially full transparency in government. People knew what the government was doing, and there was no concept of national security. That just was a non-existent concept. That's a concept that exists within this third type of governmental system, and that's a national security state. So after World War II, the governmental system that Americans had been operating under for 150 years, a limited government republic, was scotched in favor of this third type of governmental system, a national security state. Now, a national security state is totally different. Now you're talking about omnipotent powers, total powers. The power, for example, to assassinate people, which means killing them without due process of law. So here's the Fifth Amendment that says, no person shall be deprived of life without due process of law. Well, assassination is depriving a person of life without due process of law. There's no trial, there's no charges, it's just killing them. And so now you've got a fundamental shift in the nature of the federal government. The national security branch of the government now wields this omnipotent power. Now, ironically, conservatives kept referring, even today, they would keep referring to America as a republic. Well, it hasn't been a republic since the end of World War II, when it became a national security state. And notice that when you have omnipotent government, you don't have to have all the branches of government having this omnipotent power. I mean, the DEA doesn't have the power or the authority to go and assassinate people, or some other agency doesn't have the power, Homeland Security. But as long as you have one branch of the government with omnipotent powers, that makes it an omnipotent government, obviously. I mean, you just direct all your resources into that place, and that's where all the power is. And then you've got indefinite detention. The idea of trial by jury just went out. Speedy trial just went out the window. But so did the right of trial by jury. Now that brings us back to Guantanamo Bay, because this reflects everything that's going on. It reflects Glennon's thesis that here the Pentagon, the CIA set up this torture and prison center outside the United States. Notice that they could have done it here domestically, but they went outside the United States at really their imperial base in Cuba. And that's what it is. It's an imperial base. It was formed early on after the Spanish-American War, when America was moving in the direction of empire. And they substituted for the Spanish Empire. They took control of Cuba. They had a series of puppet regimes all the way to 1959 when Fidel Castro threw out the last U.S. puppet, Fulgencio Batista, a brutal dictator. And so that's how they got Guantanamo Bay. And as a matter of fact, they had a puppet regime there, and they got the puppet to sign the lease over, which is ridiculous. I mean, it's a perpetual lease, and it's a minimal lease payments, but it's empire. It's maintaining an imperial outpost outside of America's jurisdiction. So after the 9/11 attacks, the full power of the military and the CIA came to the forefront. So they started to establish this base, and they said, this is going to be independent. We're running this thing. This is a sovereign place that we're running to protect America. And we're beyond the reach of the Supreme Court. We're beyond the reach of Congress. Now, Congress deferred. You would expect that. The national security establishment had already been in existence since around 1947. It was well solidified within the governmental system. And so when the military and the CIA announced they're going to do this, they pretty much deferred. Now, people file suit with the Supreme Court, or in the federal courts that reach the Supreme Court. And here's where you get into that veneer of power that the Supreme Court says, well, no, this isn't a constitution-free zone. You don't have the authority to do that. But we're assuming jurisdiction. So if prisoners want to file habeas corpus, which is another protection that had come up through English law where people were resisting tyranny of the federal government. I mean, habeas corpus is like a linchpin of a free society. If the government's holding somebody, he has a right to petition in a court saying, bring the prisoner over to this court and show cause why he should be kept in custody or released. And the government's got to comply with that. So the Supreme Court said, well, we're going to exercise some jurisdiction. And for a while there was some habeas proceedings. But again, it was this notion that the National Security Branch permitted the federal government, the federal courts, to have this veneer of power. And that's all it was, because when push came to shove and the Pentagon and the CIA set their red line and said, there are certain prisoners here where your little habeas proceedings are not going to work, that was it. The Supreme Court just bowed out. And like I said, in Chile, they did the same thing. When Pinochet took power, the federal courts just bowed out and deferred to the national security establishment, the military, the intelligence agencies, and so forth. And they later apologized, interestingly enough, that after Pinochet was overthrown, I think it was in 1979, the federal judiciary ultimately apologized for not doing what they were supposed to do, and that is defend the Constitution against him. Well, there's no apology yet forthcoming from the Supreme Court or the federal courts, but they owe the American people an apology, because notice what these people in the Pentagon and the CIA have done to America and to the values that are reflected in the Bill of Rights. They've got this torture and prison center. Now, there's another protection in the Bill of Rights called the Cruel and Unusual Punishments Clause, where the government is prohibited from inflicting cruel and unusual punishments on people. Why? Because our ancestors understood that government would do that, and they wanted to send a message. You don't have the authority to do this. Even though it's not in the enumerated powers, we want to make sure. We want to make sure that you're prohibited from doing that. Well, the military and the CIA said, nonsense. We're in charge. We're going to torture people here, and they did. They brutally tortured people at Guantanamo Bay, but nobody's done anything about it. Why? Again, I'm trying to demonstrate they're the ones in charge here. There's nobody that has the power to control them or even the will to control them. And so they inflicted very cruel and very unusual punishments on people who had never been convicted of anything. Now keep that in mind also, that they put people in this torture and prison center saying, oh, we're going to have a trial. We're going to have a trial. Well, how was that trial going to be conducted? Well, the way that communist regimes conduct trials. In other words, they were not going to be conducted in accordance with how trials are conducted in America. I mean, what was so fascinating is that here we have this heritage of jury trials and presumption of innocence, effective assistance of counsel. The military and the CIA viewed those as just constitutional technicalities. The way that conservatives often view these things is just technicalities that let guilty people go free. So they were going to show how the cow eats the cabbage and establish their own judicial system that could have easily been modeled after any other national security state, totalitarian system, communist system, the system over on the other side of Cuba, where they just hold people, they torture them, and they don't give them a trial. They keep promising a trial, but there's, like I say, there's been people over there well over 10 years, maybe even longer, since 9/11, that haven't had a trial. And if they keep promising them a trial, but they're going to hold them there indefinitely. And that's not the only thing. That they started eavesdropping in on lawyer-client communications. Now, the Supreme Court, when it had exercised its veneer of power, said, hey, yeah, these people have a right to counsel, because the CIA and the military's position in the beginning was, no, we're not going to have those kind of technicalities here. And no right to counsel here. We're running this torture and prison center the way we want, and we're going to bring law and order to the world here. Well, the Supreme Court said, no, they're entitled to counsel. So again, you have this veneer where the military goes along with it, but they got their red lines. But then they just started eavesdropping on the communications between lawyer and client. Now, I mean, this is like, listening in on a confessional. This is how sacred this is in the law. And this is what is at the core of effective assistance of counsel. If they're not free to communicate with their client without the government eavesdropping, they're not going to provide effective assistance of counsel. So they were destroying that. And then they had the people that are deciding the guilt or innocence are military tribunal people. I mean, is that a joke or what? I mean, the verdict already is cooked into the deal. I mean, if the president, who is, of course, the commander-in-chief of the military and the CIA, says, hey, guys, I'd like you to find that guy guilty, they're gonna do what the president wants. But most of all, they're in charge. They're not going to let people go free like they do in federal courts. Sometimes juries acquit people when the government's not able to prove their guilt. Here, you have a presumption of guilt in these things, like as compared to America's judicial system, which has a presumption of innocence for the accused. So you have all these distinctions. Hearsay in our judicial system here, hearsay is not permitted because it's an out-of-court statement, and you don't have the ability to confront the person who makes it. It's somebody saying, well, he told me this. Well, how do you cross-examine the he? He's not on the stand, and so the courts don't permit hearsay except with some well-defined exceptions. Well, hearsay is going to be provided in Guantanamo if they ever permit trials. And then evidence acquired by torture, they're going to permit that too. So, I mean, it's a total joke. It's a totalitarian system. It denigrates America's heritage. But here's the thing. It's a dual judicial system that we have now. I mean, the Constitution does not provide for a double judicial system. In other words, if somebody's charged with the crime of terrorism, and terrorism is a federal crime, you can see it in the U.S. Code, you can Google it. That's why there's terrorism prosecutions in New York, Virginia, anywhere where terrorism has been committed, there's going to be a charge of terrorism because it's a crime. It's not an act of war. So what the military and the CIA did with Guantanamo is saying, we're going to create an alternative judicial system. I mean, this is just incredible. It shows you what Glennon's talking about. They're in charge. They say, we're going to establish a brand new judicial system, and it's going to be run in this way for terrorism suspects. Okay, now suppose you have somebody charged with terrorism. Where does he go? Does he go into the federal court system here, where he gets presumption of innocence, effective assistance of counsel, jury trials, or does he go into the judicial system, and I put that in quotes, of course, that exists at Guantanamo Bay, where you have military tribunals, presumption of guilt, hearsay, and so forth? Which one do you go through? It's their option. I mean, this just violates every principle of equal treatment under the law. You can have two people that are involved in the exact same terrorism, and the Pentagon and the CIA can say, well, we will permit you to go over into the federal court system, but you're coming over into our system. They make the choice. I mean, it's just incredible that the Supreme Court has permitted this, but it confirms Glennon's thesis that the Supreme Court's not going to jack, in an ultimate sense, with the CIA, the massive military-industrial complex, and the NSA. And so that's why it's still in existence. The Supreme Court, the very first time somebody brought a case, should have just said, shut this thing down. Just issued the judgment. This is unconstitutional, which it clearly is. I mean, the Constitution and these enumerated powers does not provide for a torture and prison center in a foreign country. Or, even more important or equally important, doesn't provide for an alternative judicial system. And so that's what the Supreme Court should have done. Now, it's not like Americans haven't been warned that when President Eisenhower gave his farewell address, this was in 1961, he talked about this. He says, okay, we've got a different kind of governmental system, no question about it. He called it a military-industrial complex. It's just another word for a national security state, another word for a deep state. I mean, it's all the same terminology to reflect this massive permanent military establishment, which our American ancestors were totally opposed to, a giant military intelligence force, the CIA, has the power to kill people without due process of law, including Americans, by the way. This isn't just killing foreigners. This little monster has the ability to turn inward and kill Americans, including American presidents. And then you've got the NSA, massive secret surveillance of the American people and the people of the world. So Eisenhower said, okay, this is a different kind of system we have here now. Now, he justified it into the terms of the Cold War, which is just another racket. Those of you that are familiar with our work know that we're running a conference right now called the National Security State and the Kennedy Assassination, where John Kennedy, by the time he was assassinated, he had broken through and realized that this whole Cold War thing was a racket. All these hostilities toward Russia and China, all these official enemies, all the things to keep Americans unsettled that we see today. You know, the ginning up crises with Russia and saying, oh, it's all Russia's fault. They're being assertive and aggressive, and it's all China's fault. Well, it isn't. It's the national security states that's ginning up these crises to justify its existence and its ever-increasing largesse. And Eisenhower warned about this. He said, this is a grave threat to our liberties and democratic processes, and we've got to watch it real carefully. Well, I'm not sure how many people watched it very carefully, but whether they did or didn't, the military-industrial complex, as he called it, the national security establishment, has grown over the years since that speech and since the Kennedy administration into this gigantic, monstrous apparatus within our governmental system. So those that are advocating the closure of Guantanamo Bay, of course they're right. And it's not clear yet whether the military and the CIA are going to permit President Biden to do that. I'm almost certain that Biden, along with Obama, said they were going to close it, but clearly the military and the CIA didn't permit Obama to do it, and it's just a matter of time whether they're going to permit Biden to do it, if Biden still wants to do it. But we've got to think in terms of a larger context here, and that is, what are we doing with a national security state form of governmental structure? I mean, it was justified by the Cold War. Well, I say that was a big racket as Kennedy came to that conclusion. But the Cold War was over in 1989, and it should have been dismantled at that point, and then restore a limited government republic. And that's where we libertarians come into play. We've got to lead the country out of this morass in which it finds itself. It's a bad morass. I mean, I think everybody would agree, at least in the libertarian movement, that America is moving in a very bad direction here. And it's a direction that cannot have a good ending here if we keep traveling it. So it's up to us libertarians to lead America out of this morass and raise people's vision to a higher level. That we don't need this national security establishment. Leave it to the North Koreans, Myanmars, and Pakistanis and Egyptians to have a national security state. Let us lead the world out of this morass with the restoration of our limited government republic. That's our libertarian angle for this week. Thank you for tuning in. Thanks for your great support, and I'll see you next week.